It's November 1805. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark have just arrived at the mouth of the Columbia River on Chinook land that would later become Washington. They, along with their entire crew, are probably cold, hungry, and exhausted after traveling thousands of miles from Illinois to the Pacific Ocean. And now, a year and a half into their journey, they found themselves stuck in an unfamiliar place until the end of winter. The Corps of Discovery needed to find the right place to camp for the winter where they could survive the next 4 months. The captains, rather than deciding for the entire crew, chose to take a poll to determine where the group would stay. Their options were to either cross to the south bank of the Columbia, explore the Sandy River, or go back east toward what is now the Dalles. All 33 members of the Corps of Discovery had their voices heard, including one man whose opinion would have almost certainly been discounted if he'd been home in Kentucky, because he was an enslaved black man. His name was York.
What I think the important thing is in this is that York was able to at least voice his opinion.
James Holmberg is the curator of special collections at the Filson Historical Society. It's because of Holmberg that Clark's letters to his brother Jonathan were preserved and published.
I mean, Sacagawea gets to voice her opinion. All the men, of course, voice their opinion, and that York was included as well. So he is clearly one of the group. You know, he's not this nameless person who is just there as a servant and has no interacting, is not a contributing member of the group. You know, they are all in this together, and everybody's opinion counts.
From the Gert Boyle Studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. When most people think about the Lewis and Clark expedition, the first people that come to mind are, obviously, Lewis and Clark, and perhaps also Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman who traveled with them. But there's another person mentioned in their journals who was an essential part of the expedition, York.
Well, York, who is, again, a product of the frontier, he can do all the same things that these other men can do. Clark probably did not hesitate for a moment. You know, he knew in his mind if he was going to go on this trip, York was going to go too.
Like Sacagawea, York's entire life was memorialized by others. We have no record of his own thoughts or perspective. His contributions to the expedition were documented primarily through the eyes of Lewis and Clark, two white men. So much of what history has recorded about his life is seen through the lens of whiteness in the era of chattel slavery in the United States. York was born in the colony of Virginia, enslaved to the Clark family. There's no exact date for when he was born. Historians think somewhere between 1770 and 1775. He was Clark's so-called body servant, which means York would have been around the same age as Clark, give or take a few years.
Well, York is a product of his time. He's a child of his time in many respects, and that means that he was enslaved.
This is Quintard Taylor speaking to OPB in 2008 for the Oregon Experience documentary Searching for York. He was a historian and former professor of history at the University of Washington, specializing in Black American history before his death in 2025. York's parents, Old York and Rose, were also enslaved by Clark's father, John Clark III. In 1785, the Clark family moved from Virginia to Kentucky, bringing the people they enslaved with them. When John died in 1799, William became York and his parents' enslaver. Following the Louisiana Purchase, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned the Corps of Discovery to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. The expedition was to be led by Meriwether Lewis, who then recruited Clark.
Thomas Jefferson was very explicit when he gave instructions to Meriwether Lewis about the kind of people that he wanted to select for that expedition. They were planning a very challenging, dangerous, difficult assignment. Jefferson understood that, and Meriwether Lewis understood that as well.
Darrell Milner is a professor emeritus of Black Studies at Portland State University. He's an expert in African American history, specifically in Oregon and California, and has studied York's story extensively. He says York was an asset to the expedition.
And so the notion that York was somehow a luxury for William Clark on that expedition is simply ludicrous on its face. York was selected with the same characteristics and values and potential and qualities in mind as the rest of the members of that expedition were.
York is mentioned over 100 times in the journals by Lewis, Clark, and a few other members of the expedition. Like most others on the crew, he's not given much physical description or any characterization, only that he had dark skin and curly black hair and that he was big and tall. Historian Quintard Taylor said that it makes sense that these kinds of details were sparse.
And the journals weren't really being written for the kinds of questions that we raise today. It was less important for them to, quote, establish the role of York or to talk about York and his significance in terms of the expedition than it was simply to report on the flora and fauna or to report on the various experiences of the expedition in general.
Because of this, there were probably things he did during the journey that were never recorded in the journals. But his contribution to the Corps of Discovery was just as important as the contributions of his white peers. Since it was essentially a military expedition, every person was expected to work the same as everyone else.
The fact that York grew up in Kentucky and the fact that he grew up on a plantation and in a period when Kentucky had just gone through its own frontier era would suggest that York would have almost automatically skills that would be necessary for working on the frontier.
York had something the other members of the crew didn't: a wife. Lewis and Clark chose men who were skilled hunters and outdoorsmen, and also unmarried. The thought being traveling across the country was easier if you were single. It's possible that they didn't view York's marriage as legitimate. Since enslaved people were viewed as chattel property, they couldn't enter any legally binding contracts, like marriage. York could swim, an uncommon skill for enslaved people at the time. In a journal entry from June 1804, Clark writes that York swam across the river to gather wild cresses for their dinner one night. In the journals, the explorers also write that York hunted frequently. His ability to use a gun was also uncommon at the time. Enslaved people wouldn't have been entrusted with a weapon for fear that they would rebel. There are multiple instances where York was sent on hunting parties with the other men. One such instance includes an entry from December 1804, when York was one of 15 men who went on a buffalo hunt to replenish their supplies. After a flash flood at Great Falls on the Missouri River trapped Clark and a few others in a ravine, York risked his life to save them. When another member of the expedition, Sergeant Charles Floyd, became sick, York was the one to take care of him before he died. A central goal of the expedition was laying claim on the territory that made up the recent Louisiana Purchase, paving the way for colonization of native land. As they crossed North America, the groups traveled through the homelands of many indigenous tribes and bands. How they were received varied greatly by tribe. Some were friendly towards them, others saw them as hostile trespassers. But as the Corps navigated unfamiliar territory, they often relied on food, trade, and guidance from tribes they encountered to survive. And York became instrumental in communicating with Native Americans during the journey.
What we do know is that there are points in the expedition where the very survival and success of the expedition depended on the loyalty of York. And that was especially true when they were beginning their return journey after their wintering in Oregon and going back, retracing their steps. The expedition had been reduced to essentially the status of beggars among the native population. They had no food, they had no trade goods, or very few trade goods. They needed the native population as guides. They needed the goodwill of the native population simply for their survival. And in those circumstances, York rose to the fore as one of the individuals who really allowed that expedition to proceed, who really allowed that expedition to make a successful return.
When you look at the oral tradition and you look at our suspicions about these travelers, one of the most notable things that you'll find in tribes from the Dakotas to the west is our fascination with York. Absolute fascination with York.
Bobby Connor is a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation and the director of the Temastlicht Cultural Institute in Pendleton. She spoke to OPB about York in 2008.
The color of his skin, the fact that he was apart from the rest of the men, he was not like the rest of the men in many respects, was not wasted on us. And his skill, being a man's man in Indian country, is really important.
The white members of the expedition's perspective on this is chronicled in journals. In one entry, Sergeant John Ordway writes that, quote, the greatest curiosity to them was York, and that, quote, all the nations made a great deal of him, end quote, due to the color of his skin. Clark wrote that York was referred to as Big Medicine by some tribal leaders. One of the things Clark writes about is York's dancing for Native American tribes. It's not clear whether York had a choice in this or not. And in describing the incident, some secondary sources reduce York to a caricature. Daryl Milner has written about how historic interpretations of York's role in the expedition often reflected the racism of their time. In an issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, he wrote that after the American Revolution, various racist stereotypes and caricatures of Black Americans were popularized as a way for pro-slavery advocates to defend the institution. This continued into the Jim Crow era.
What has happened in terms of the scholarship and the retelling of the Lewis and Clark story is that people who have a particular viewpoint or a particular vested interest have mined the journals for the kind of information that supports their particular viewpoint and helps them create the particular image of the expedition and the experiences that they want to portray and they want to project. The incident that happened in the Mandan villages of York's dancing for the native populations for their entertainment is, I think, an especially egregious example of that. In reality, the expedition danced every day. They danced every evening. That was their primary form of entertainment and, to a degree, exercise and relaxation. Every member of the expedition participated in that.
This kind of misrepresentation can also be found in how the story of the rest of York's life is told. Coming up after a break, we'll hear about what it was like for York to return home. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you appreciate this episode, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll bring you more stories of people who make the Pacific Northwest what it is every Monday morning. You can also follow OPB on Instagram @OPB, or follow me directly @Jen Chavez OPB. That's Jen with 2 N's, and I'll keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about York and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to the show. Some things in the expedition journals offer insight into racism York may have experienced during the journey. For example, Clark wrote in 1804 that York nearly lost his eye after someone threw sand at him. It's not clear whether this was a direct attack or just horseplay among companions, but clearly York was badly injured. There's no indication that anyone was punished for hurting York in this way. But York wouldn't have been brought along with the expedition if Clark didn't believe in his abilities. And his voice mattered, like when the crew reached the ocean in 1805 and voted on where to spend the winter. It's as though the journey west allowed some of the systemic barriers from the east to drop. That's definitely not to say they didn't exist, but at times the need for survival trumped anything else. But after the expedition, each member received double their pay according to their military rank and was granted 320 acres of land. The captains were given 1,600 acres each and double their pay as well, and York received nothing. His only option was to return to his life in slavery in Kentucky. Clark wrote that York expected to be freed due to the, quote, immense services he provided, but he refused to let York go. Clark wrote in a letter to his brother Jonathan that,
I did wish to do well by him, but as he got such a notion about freedom and his immense services, that I do not expect he will be much service to me again. I do not think him that his services has been so great or my situation would permit me to liberate him.
what would it have been like for York to return to how his life had been before? He had spent nearly 3 years as part of the expedition, hunting alongside the other crew members, possibly sleeping in the same tent as them, traveling 8,000 miles with them. And all of that resulted in nothing once he returned home. No recognition, no payment, and no glory.
So we know that 9 years after the return of the expedition, York is still a slave.
No matter what their working relationship had been during their travels across the country, Clark still saw him as inferior.
In looking at the relationship of William Clark and York, sometimes people think, oh, these guys grew up together. They went on the expedition together. They were friends. You know, they were buddies. They were these lifelong close companions. Well, they were lifelong companions up to a certain point in the post-expedition days, but we should never, ever make the mistake of thinking of them as friends, because they weren't.
The founding fathers attempted to create a country that was supposed to be a representative democracy. But at the time that they were doing that, they were also creating a country that was a practicing slave-holding society. Now, those two institutions are incompatible. You can't be a democracy and a slave society at the same time. But this country tried to do that for almost 70 or 80 years. You know, we finally concluded we couldn't, and we fought a civil war to try and resolve that contradiction.
Slavery was entrenched into American society in Clark and York's lifetime. As an enslaver, Clark was legally permitted to beat the people he enslaved at any time. At the end of the day, Clark was seemingly comfortable with the life he was born into and unwilling to give that up. York was someone he knew since childhood, but ultimately, Clark might not have seen York as a person, but as a possession. However, as part of the expedition, York had experienced something different.
The Buzz Aldrin syndrome. Once you've been to the moon, what is there? You know, so York has experienced things he never experienced before, where he, perhaps for the first time in his life, realizes that there's another way of looking at who I am as an African American, who I am as a slave, you know, where he can look at Native peoples who thought, again, he was better than the white guys he was with. He was superior to them.
The tension between them grew even more when Clark moved his family to St. Louis to become the U.S. agent for Indian Affairs in 1808. York's wife, whose name was not recorded, was enslaved to another man. That meant she couldn't follow him to Missouri. Since York and his wife were not allowed to get legally married, they could be separated at any time. In order to be near his wife, York asked Clark if he could remain in Louisville and either be hired out or sold to someone else. Clark told him no over and over again, and only ceded by allowing York to visit his wife for a few weeks. He was so excited to see his wife that York told others Clark had given him 4 to 5 months in Louisville, rather than weeks. When word got back to Clark about York's exaggeration, he was furious. York was forced to return to St. Louis and became increasingly upset after being separated from his wife. Clark's response to this, as described in a letter to his brother Jonathan from May 1809, was to give York a, quote, severe trouncing. By August, Clark wrote to Jonathan that,
I have become displeased with him and shall hire or sell him. On the 5th of next month, I shall set him off in a boat to Wheeling as a hand. On his return to the Falls, I wish much to hire him or sell him.
It's not clear where York went after this, and there are conflicting sources. Clark doesn't mention York in his journals or any letters again after that. York nearly disappeared from the written record until 1832, when the journalist Washington Irving interviewed Clark.
And he asked about York, and Clark tells him, that he's set him free, doesn't say when, which is an important point because, for many, many years, it was assumed that when they got back, York was freed.
Clark told Irving that he gave York 6 horses and a wagon to start his own freight delivery business. According to Clark, York's business failed when he couldn't wake up early enough, and 2 of his horses got sick. Clark claimed that York decided to return to him, but before he got back, he died of cholera in Tennessee. This narrative, of course, is convenient for the institution of slavery and represents another type of racist stereotype that Daryl Milner wrote about.
It was just a routine expectation and assumption on the part of slaveholders that black people preferred to be slaves, preferred slavery to freedom. And so that Washington Irving story becomes an intimate part of the Clark-York story in the scholarship of the next 200 years.
It's unlikely that Clark's version of the story actually happened, Daryl Milner says. There isn't any evidence to back up Clark freeing York. And why would York, someone who spent years seeking freedom, return to slavery? The person who enslaved York's wife eventually moved from Louisville to Natchez, Mississippi, which meant that York had no reason to remain in Louisville. Not much is known about York after that, and there is no exact date of death recorded for him. Historians estimate it was sometime around or after 1815. There is another narrative of what could have happened to York after he and Clark parted ways. Zenas Leonard, a fur trader who published a memoir of his travels, wrote that he met a black man living with the Apsalaga people in what is now northern Wyoming.
In this village, we found a Negro man who informed us that he first came to this country with Lewis and Clark, and in a few years returned again with a Mr. McKinney, and has remained here ever since. He has acquired a correct knowledge of their manner of living and speaks their language fluently.
But this version of events also isn't proven to be true.
Now, just as in the case of the William Clark story, you have to re-examine that story as well. There is no doubt that Zenas Leonard was in that Indian village in the 1830s and met a black man there. There is considerable question about whether that black man was really York or not. To assume he was York, we have to forget or overlook the fact that there were many black mountain men. And we tend to do that in American history because we always pretend that York was the only black man in the West.
York's fate is unknown, but ultimately his contributions to the Corps of Discovery can't be overlooked. without York, the expedition may not have been as successful as it was. And in spite of the way American history memorializes white men like Lewis and Clark as heroes and leaves out the stories of so many others, York and his contributions are getting some of the recognition they deserve today. In the fall of 2020, a statue of white newspaper editor Harvey Scott was toppled in Portland's Mount Tabor Park as part of racial justice protests. A few months later, another statue appeared in its place, installed in secret overnight, a larger-than-life bust of York. The temporary sculpture, made from styrofoam and plastic, only lasted a few months before it was vandalized and removed itself. But in that time, it had a lasting impact on a lot of people, including York scholar Daryl Milner. He spoke about what it meant to him in 2021 on OPB's Think Out Loud.
With the addition of York at the top of Mount Tabor, it was a transformative experience. And I returned almost every day after York arrived. And there was an attraction. There was a pull there. There was a feeling that, this was an opportunity for a story that had been lost and had been hidden and had been distorted for so long in American history, to once again be the subject of attention, of discussion, and the attempt to understand what York's life had been and the significance of it. So I suppose all those things were part of what attracted me and kept me coming back. But it was just a very, very powerful experience to be able to walk the top of Mount Tabor and to see York there and to have his story once again before the public.
The sculptor behind the bust, Todd McRain, made a new permanent version in bronze. Today, it's on display among other important works in the Portland Art Museum, so new generations can reflect on York's role in the American story. Most of the voices you heard in this episode were featured in the 2008 OPB documentary Searching for York, produced by Beth Harrington and co-produced by Lawrence Johnson. You can watch it at opb.org or find a link in our show notes. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Stephanie Hensley produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Layla Isbell mixed and mastered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Julie Sabatier, and Sage Van Wing. Beth Harrington and Dave Miller did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And if you have a question for us, please reach out. You can email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.